Be me, Jonathan, a few years shy of 40. Work as an interior designer in a small boutique studio. It's not one of those soulless corporate gigs where you just pick beige paint for 1,000 identical office cubicles. We do high-end residential and unique commercial spaces. The kind of work that actually requires a brain and some artistic talent. Our team is small, maybe a dozen people in total. We've all been working together for years. It's a well-oiled machine. The boss, Melvin, is an old-school guy. He was a legendary designer back in the day. Now he runs the business side of things. Melvin's only rule is merit. If your work is good, you're golden. If it's bad, you're out. Simple as that. No office politics, no drama, no pointless meetings. Just schematics, mood boards, and the quiet hum of productivity. It was a good place to work, a little bubble of sanity in a world that seemed to be going nuts. Then there's Santino. Santino is our star player. The guy is a natural. He just sees spaces differently than normal people. He could take a concrete box and turn it into something you'd see on the cover of a magazine. He's not arrogant about it, which is the weird part. He's just quiet, focused, and incredibly good at his job. He pulls in the biggest clients and the most prestigious projects. The rest of us were happy to ride his coattails because his success brought money and stability to the whole firm. Allison is our senior designer, sharp as a tack and with zero patience for nonsense. She's the one who deals with difficult clients and impossible contractors, a true professional. And Miller is our project manager, the guy who handles the numbers, the schedules, the logistics. A man of few words and many spreadsheets. He's the anchor that keeps our creative flights of fancy from crashing into the rocks of reality. For years, this was the rhythm of our lives. Work hard, create beautiful things, get paid. We were good at what we did, and the industry knew it. We had a reputation for quality and for delivering on time. A few months back, maybe late spring, things started to change. Melvin landed a fish. A whale, actually. It was a massive contract with a huge, multinational tech corporation that was building a new headquarters. They wanted a showpiece, a campus that would make their competitors look like they were operating out of a garage. The budget was astronomical, the kind of money that could set our little studio up for the next decade. Melvin was ecstatic, but also nervous. This was the big leagues. We had a big meeting where he laid it all out. The scope, the timeline, the potential. Everyone was buzzing. This was the kind of project you dream about. Then Melvin cleared his throat. He had this look on his face that I'd only seen once before, when he had to tell us a massive shipment of Italian marble had arrived completely shattered. He explained there was a condition in the contract, a non-negotiable clause from the client's corporate social responsibility department. Before we could start the design phase, our entire senior staff had to undergo a mandatory diversity, equity, and inclusion training seminar. The room went silent. You could hear a pin drop. Allison was the first to speak. She asked if it was the standard HR stuff about not being a jerk to your coworkers. Melvin shook his head slowly. It wasn't standard. The client had their own list of approved consultants. They were sending one of their top people to conduct the training personally. It was an all-day event, mandatory attendance. We all knew what this meant. This wasn't about team building. This was an ideological purity test. A low groan went through the room. Miller just closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. Santino, for his part, just sat there, looking at the floor, not saying a word. Melvin held up his hands. He told us he knew it was garbage, that he fought against it, but the client wouldn't budge. The contract was too important to lose over something like this. His advice was to just sit there, nod, and get through it. 1 day of nonsense for 5 years of financial security. That was the deal. We all reluctantly agreed. How bad could it really be? The day of the training arrived. It was a Tuesday, I think. The atmosphere in the studio was like a morgue. Nobody was talking. We were all just sitting at our desks, waiting for the executioner to arrive. Melvin had cleared out our main conference room, the one with the big screen where we present to clients. He'd set up a table with coffee and pastries, trying to make it seem like a normal, pleasant event. Nobody touched them. At 9 a.m. sharp, the door opened. In walked a woman. Her name was Waverly. She looked to be in her early 30s, dressed in a severe all-black outfit that looked both expensive and deeply uncomfortable. She had an asymmetrical haircut and large, thick-rimmed glasses. The most notable thing about her was her expression, a permanent faint sneer, as if she was constantly smelling something unpleasant. She didn't say hello. She didn't introduce herself. Her eyes swept across the room, cataloging each of us. Her gaze lingered on the men, especially on Santino. Melvin stepped forward to greet her, hand outstretched. She completely ignored his hand and just nodded curtly. Her first words were not directed at any of us, but at the room itself. She announced that the open plan layout was a classic manifestation of surveillance culture rooted in patriarchal control. We all just stared at her. Our office layout was designed for collaboration, to make it easy to walk over and look at someone's plans. Melvin's welcoming smile flickered and died. Waverly walked over to the wall where we had framed photos of our best work. She peered at a photo of a minimalist, Zen-inspired apartment we did. She declared it an example of problematic aesthetic erasure, an attempt to create a sterile, masculine void, devoid of lived female experience. I had no idea what any of that meant. I designed that apartment with a female colleague for a female client who loved it, but I knew better than to say anything. Melvin's words echoed in my head. Just get through it. We all filed into the conference room and took our seats. Waverly stood at the front, a laptop connected to the big screen. She started her presentation. It was a blur of corporate jargon and academic buzzwords. Intersectionality, hegemonic masculinity, unconscious bias, emotional labor. It was like being lectured by a sentient thesaurus. She didn't engage with us. She talked at us. Her tone was condescending, as if she were a biologist explaining simple concepts to a particularly dim group of chimpanzees. The first hour was just theory, abstract concepts and diagrams that made no sense. Then she decided it was time for the interactive portion. She wanted us to go around the room and confess a time we had benefited from our privilege. The silence was deafening. Nobody said a word. People were looking at their hands, at the ceiling, anywhere but at her. After a solid minute of awkward silence, Waverly's sneer deepened. She said our silence was a form of defensive fragility, a common reaction among those who are unwilling to confront their own complicity in oppressive systems. She decided to change tactics. She wanted to review our studio's portfolio, to perform a DEI audit on our body of work. Melvin reluctantly agreed and pulled up our website on the big screen. This is where things started to go from merely annoying to actively insulting. She went through our projects one by one, tearing them apart not on their design merits, but on ideological grounds. A beautiful, warm family home we designed for a couple with 3 kids. She called it a monument to the oppressive nuclear family structure, a sleek, modern restaurant interior that won an award. She claimed its use of dark wood and leather was an evocation of antiquated all-male private clubs, creating an exclusionary atmosphere. Allison couldn't take it anymore. She spoke up, her voice calm but firm. She explained that the materials for the restaurant were chosen to create a sense of intimacy and luxury, as requested by the client, who happened to be a woman. Waverly turned to her slowly. Her response was dripping with condescension. She informed Allison that the client's wishes were irrelevant because the client was also a victim of internalized misogyny, conditioned to desire aesthetics that reinforce her own oppression. Allison just stared at her, speechless. It was like trying to argue with a brick wall, a very arrogant, jargon-spouting brick wall. Waverly then moved on to a gorgeous library we had designed for a retired professor. It was all warm wood, comfortable chairs, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A reader's paradise. Her verdict? The very concept of a library, she explained, was rooted in a history of academic gatekeeping by white men. Our design, by being so traditional and appealing, was therefore perpetuating a legacy of intellectual violence. Miller, who had been silent the whole time, let out a short, sharp sigh. It was the loudest sound he'd made all morning. Waverly's head snapped toward him. She asked if he had something to contribute. Miller just shook his head and went back to staring at the table. Her eyes narrowed. She clearly wasn't used to being met with anything other than enthusiastic agreement or fearful silence. Our passive resistance was getting under her skin. And then she found her real target. She clicked on the tab for Santino's portfolio. The screen filled with images of his work. Each project was stunning. Clean lines, perfect proportions, innovative use of materials. You could feel the energy in the room shift. Even Waverly was silent for a moment, looking at the images. I thought maybe, just maybe, she would recognize pure talent when she saw it. I was wrong. Her silence was not one of admiration. It was the silence of a prosecutor who had just found their star exhibit. She navigated to his most famous project, the penthouse apartment for a tech billionaire. It had been featured in a dozen magazines. It was the project that put our firm on the map for the new contract. It was a masterpiece of modern design, bold, confident, and unapologetically luxurious. Waverly let the image sit on the screen for a long moment. Then she turned to face us, a triumphant little smile on her face. She said, "Now, let's deconstruct this." She pointed at the screen. She talked about the aggressive phallic energy of the floor-to-ceiling windows. She described the open-concept kitchen as a panoptic space designed for the surveillance and control of domestic labor. The polished concrete floors were, according to her, a symbol of cold, unyielding masculine emotionality. It was the most unhinged, insane design critique I had ever heard in my life. She wasn't analyzing the design. She was projecting a whole universe of bizarre theories onto it. Through it all, Santino sat perfectly still. He didn't react. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. Waverly seemed to be getting more and more agitated by his silence. She wanted a reaction. She needed him to fight back, to get angry, to prove her theories about male fragility correct. But he gave her nothing. Finally, she turned her full attention to him, abandoning the pretense of critiquing the work and moving on to critiquing the man himself. She asked him, her voice dripping with mock curiosity, to explain how his identity as a cisgender, heterosexual, white male had informed the inherently toxic and exclusionary nature of his design. The room got cold. This was no longer a stupid corporate exercise. This was a personal attack, a public shaming. Santino looked at her. His voice, when he finally spoke, was quiet and even. He said, "I designed what I thought the client would love, and he did. It's a space that is beautiful and functions well. That's the job." Waverly let out a small, sharp laugh. It was a nasty sound. She told him that his definition of beauty and function was not objective truth. It was a socially constructed viewpoint that had been handed down to him by centuries of patriarchal dominance. His success, she implied, was not due to his talent, but a direct result of his unearned privilege. She was essentially telling the most talented person in the room that his skills were worthless, that his achievements were a historical accident. I looked at Melvin. He looked physically ill. He had his mouth slightly open, like he wanted to intervene, but the thought of the multi-million-dollar contract was keeping him pinned to his chair. Allison was glaring at Waverly with pure, unadulterated hatred. If looks could kill, Waverly would have been a pile of ash on the floor. Miller was just slowly shaking his head, looking down at his hands. Waverly wasn't done. She was going in for the kill. She wanted to make an example of Santino. She told the room that for the next exercise, we would all participate in helping Santino understand his own biases. Her plan was for Santino to stand at the front of the room, next to the image of his masterpiece, and publicly identify the problematic elements himself. She wanted him to perform a ritual of self-flagellation, to denounce his own work, his own talent, in front of all of his colleagues. She walked over to the supply table and picked up a black dry erase marker. She held it out to Santino. "Let's begin," she said, her voice full of smug certainty. "Tell us, Santino, where did you go wrong?" The entire room held its breath. Everything seemed to slow down. This was the moment, the breaking point. The reason Melvin had warned us to just get through it. We were all looking at Santino, waiting to see what he would do. Would he refuse? Would he argue? Would he storm out? Or would he take the marker, walk to the front of the room, and play her sick little game for the sake of the contract? He looked at the marker in her outstretched hand. He looked at her smug, expectant face. He looked around the room, at all of us, his friends and colleagues watching him. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and then he stood up. He stood up. Not quickly, not aggressively. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The sound of his chair scraping lightly against the polished concrete floor seemed incredibly loud in the dead silent room. Waverly's smug smile widened just a fraction. This was it. The confrontation she had been building towards. She was ready. She had a flowchart in her head for every possible reaction. Denial, anger, whataboutism. She was a master of this game. Melvin looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He half rose from his chair, a hand slightly outstretched, as if to tell Santino to just sit down and play along. But Santino didn't look at her. He didn't look at Melvin. He turned and walked not towards the front of the room where she and the whiteboard waited, but towards his own workspace at the far end of the open-plan studio. Every head in the room followed him, a slow, collective turn. Waverly's smile faltered. This wasn't on her script. "Excuse me," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "The exercise is up here." Santino didn't respond. He didn't even seem to hear her. He reached his desk, a large drafting table covered in sketches and material samples. Everything was neat, organized, the space of a disciplined mind. He ignored the laptop, the Wacom tablet, all the modern tools. He reached for a long cardboard tube that was leaning against the leg of his table. With a soft rustling sound, he pulled out a huge rolled-up piece of vellum, a technical drawing. He walked back towards the conference room, but not to the front. He went to the massive empty oak table in the center, where we usually spread out blueprints for review. He carefully unrolled the drawing, using paperweights from his pocket to hold down the curling corners. It was the master floor plan for the new corporate headquarters. The Whale. The project that was the entire reason for this ridiculous ordeal. Waverly was speechless. She just stood there, marker in hand, watching him. "What do you think you're doing?" She finally managed to get out. Her voice was thin, strained. Santino ignored her. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out two things: a beautifully worn leather pouch and a silver architect's scale ruler. He unzipped the pouch and selected a specific graphite pencil, not a cheap disposable one. This was a professional tool, sharpened to a razor-fine point. He leaned over the blueprint, his body shielding it from the rest of the room. He consulted a small notebook from his pocket, then placed the scale ruler on a section of the plan, and then we heard it. A soft, crisp, scratching sound. The sound of a sharp graphite pencil making a precise annotation on a technical drawing. It was the sound of actual work being done. In that moment, the entire artificial reality of Waverly's seminar shattered. The spell was broken. She was a talking head in a room where real, important work needed to get done. The sound was a signal, an unspoken declaration. I am a professional. I have a job to do. And you are in my way. A few seconds passed. The only sound was Santino's pencil. Then, another sound. A quiet but decisive click. I looked over at Miller, our project manager. He had calmly taken out his big, expensive-looking noise-canceling headphones. The click was the sound of him turning the power on. He slipped them over his ears, and his entire posture changed. He was in his own world now. He opened his laptop, which had been closed on the table in front of him, and a complex spreadsheet instantly filled the screen. His fingers began to fly across the keyboard. He was now, for all intents and purposes, alone in his office. Waverly's face was turning a blotchy red. She looked from the working Santino to the completely oblivious Miller. Her authority was bleeding out all over the conference room floor. She turned her gaze to the rest of us, a look of desperation in her eyes. She needed to get control back. Before she could speak, Allison acted. She didn't look at Waverly. She turned directly to me, her expression all business. Her voice wasn't a whisper, but it wasn't a shout either. It was a normal, professional office volume. "Jonathan," she said, tapping her pen on her notepad. "Did you get the final quote from the stonemasons for the Italian marble? The client wants to see the comparison with the Portuguese limestone by end of day." It was brilliant. She wasn't protesting. She was working. She was pulling me, and by extension the rest of the room, back into our real jobs. I understood immediately. I opened my own laptop. "Just came in this morning," I replied, my fingers clattering on the keys as I opened my email. "I'll forward it to you right now. The price difference is significant." "This is a mandatory training session." Waverly's voice was suddenly shrill. It cut through the quiet hum of activity. "You are required to participate." Nobody looked at her. It was like a switch had been flipped. Another designer across the table started sketching on his tablet. The two junior associates started quietly discussing a lighting fixture catalog. Within the space of about 90 seconds, the entire room had seamlessly transitioned from a captive audience into a functioning design studio. The air was filled with the low murmur of professional conversations, the click of keyboards, the rustle of paper. Waverly was standing alone at the front of the room. The slide on the big screen behind her, showing Santino's problematic penthouse, was completely ignored. She was irrelevant. The public humiliation she had planned for Santino had spectacularly backfired. She was the one being publicly humiliated, not by insults or anger, but by something far more devastating. Total, absolute indifference. Her planned power play had been met with the ultimate power play of competence. We didn't need to argue with her ideology. We just had to do our jobs, and in doing so, reveal her for what she was. A useless obstruction. "I will be reporting this," she shouted, her voice cracked. "This entire office is a hostile work environment. I will report every single one of you to corporate." Santino paused his drawing for a second. He looked up, not at her, but at the large wall clock. He checked it against his own watch, made another small note on the blueprint, and went back to work. He was on a deadline. That was the final blow. Her threats were less important to him than his own schedule. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. The whole situation was just too perfect. Throughout all of this, Melvin had been sitting at the head of the table, watching everything unfold. I couldn't read his expression. It was a mask of neutrality. He was the one with everything to lose. His business, his reputation, the contract. I saw him take a deep breath. He had a choice to make. Back the consultant sent by the client, or back his own team. He stood up. The room didn't go silent this time. The work continued, but the ambient noise level dropped slightly. We were all aware that the final act of this little drama was about to play out. Melvin walked calmly around the table until he was standing next to Waverly. She looked at him with a mixture of fury and hope. She probably thought he was going to step in and enforce her authority. Melvin put on a polite, professional smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "Waverly," he said, his voice calm and even. "Thank you for coming in today. You've given us a great deal to consider." It was the most perfect corporate dismissal I'd ever heard. Her jaw dropped. "Consider? They are openly defying the training. This is insubordination." Melvin's smile didn't waver. He gestured around the room at his team, all of them diligently working. "As you can see," he said smoothly, "we're under a tremendous amount of pressure with the new project. In fact, that's the very project Santino is working on right now, the one for your client." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "We simply can't afford to lose a whole day. Deadlines are deadlines." He then gently placed a hand on her back, not in a friendly way, but in a firm, guiding way. He began to steer her towards the conference room door. "I'll be sure to include a note in our report about how invigorating your session was," he continued, his voice a masterpiece of polite insincerity. "We'll be in touch." She was sputtering, trying to form words, but he gave her no opening. "Hostile, unprofessional, you'll hear from my superiors," she stammered, as he expertly maneuvered her out of the room and into the main studio space. He walked her all the way to the front door. We could hear their muffled voices, then the click of the door closing. Melvin stood at the door for a moment, his back to us. Then he turned around. He looked across the studio at all of us. He looked tired, but relieved. He scanned the room, making eye contact with each of us. He saw a team that had stood together, that had defended its best player, and that had upheld the simple standard of professional dignity. He didn't say a word. He just gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. It was a nod of approval, of thanks, of solidarity. And then he walked back to his office and closed the door. The quiet hum of work continued for another minute. Then Santino straightened up from the blueprint, stretching his back. He looked over at Miller, who was still in his own world with his headphones on. "Hey, Miller," Santino called out, his voice normal again. "When you get a second, I need you to double-check the load-bearing calculations for this main atrium beam. Something looks off." Miller pulled off his headphones as if nothing had happened. "On it," he said, and started typing again. It was over. We had won, not by shouting or arguing, but by quietly, collectively, choosing to do our jobs. The next 2 weeks were tense. We all half expected to get a furious call from the client's corporate office, telling us the deal was off. Melvin was quiet, didn't mention the incident. We all just put our heads down and worked harder than ever on the proposal for the new headquarters. Santino was a man possessed. He was in early, stayed late. The designs he was producing were the best of his career. It was like the failed attempt to shame him had only fueled his creative fire. He was showing them, and us, that his talent was real. Finally, the day of the big presentation arrived. Melvin, Santino, and Allison went to the client's skyscraper downtown. The rest of us waited at the studio, pretending to work, but mostly just refreshing our emails. They were gone for hours. Just after 4 p.m., Melvin's car pulled into our parking lot. The three of them walked in. They were unsmiling, their faces grim. My stomach dropped. We'd lost. Our little rebellion had cost us everything. Melvin called everyone into the conference room, the same room where the disastrous training had taken place. We all gathered, silent, expecting the worst. Melvin stood at the front of the room, Santino and Allison on either side of him. He looked at us all for a long moment, and then he broke into the biggest, widest grin I had ever seen on his face. "We got it," he said, and the room exploded, cheering, clapping, people hugging. The relief was incredible. After things calmed down, Allison told us what happened. They had presented Santino's designs. The clients were blown away. The CEO himself had come down to look at the plans and had called Santino a genius. Near the end of the meeting, one of the VPs from HR, a woman with a severe haircut just like Waverly's, had cleared her throat. She mentioned that there had been a somewhat negative report from the DEI consultant about her visit to our studio. Melvin said he just looked her in the eye and said, "Waverly? Oh yes. She provided some very interesting perspectives. We'll certainly take her notes under advisement as we proceed." Then the CEO had clapped Santino on the shoulder and said, "Whatever you guys are doing over there, keep doing it. This is exactly the kind of bold, powerful vision we want for our company's future." The HR VP had just shrunk in her chair and said nothing more. The complaint had been neutralized by the sheer, undeniable quality of the work. Competence had trumped ideology. That night, Melvin took us all out for the most expensive dinner and drinks the company account could handle. We didn't talk much about what happened with Waverly. We didn't need to. We just celebrated the victory. A victory for our craft, for our team, and for the simple, quiet dignity of a job well done. It was one of the few times in recent memory I felt like the world actually made sense.